The Rigel Black Chronicles, Book 1, The Pureblood Pretense. Chapter 9. Saturday was going to be great. With no classes to swallow the free spaces in her schedule, she woke early and slipped out of the dorms to find the library. If she got a head start on Flint's homework assignments, she could finish them before her classmates realized she had more work than she should. She had to stop and stare for a moment when she reached the library doors. Her family's library had a well-curated selection, and the Black Library at Grimold Place was nothing to sniff at. But Hogwarts had a library that looked as though it spontaneously generated a copy of every book ever written the world over. She wasn't even sure it ought to fit inside the castle, and after a moment of dizzying disorientation, she stopped thinking about it and let the undetectable extension charms do their thing. The sun was barely visible through the windows, but the lamps were lit at the study tables. She chose an out-of-the-way desk and unrolled Flint's letter to remind herself of the assignments. Due Monday, 14 inches on the properties of the venomous tentacular plant, including how it is grown and harvested, and a labelled diagram drawn to scale of the important features. Due Wednesday, 10 inches on switching spells and how they relate to and compare with swapping spells. Due Wednesday, 12 inches on the late 16th century goblin rebellions headed by Urlag the Terrible. Due Thursday, 1 roll of parchment on the merits and consequences of using different materials in brewing potions that affect the nervous system. Rigel re-rolled the parchment and told herself firmly, "I can do this." It wasn't anything impossible. She could think of several arguments to make for the potions essay already, and she knew enough about venomous tentacular that she could probably get away with just one other source. She had never learned to draw, so she hoped Professor Sprout didn't grade on artistry. The history and charms essays were a mystery. She was aware of goblin rebellions generally as a thing that sometimes happened, but she had no idea who led which ones. And if she'd been put on the spot, she would have said switching spells and swapping spells were definitely the same thing. In the stacks dedicated to charms, she found the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 5, along with a book called Charms of Equal Exchange, which looked promising. Before she was halfway through the essay, she had taken 4 additional trips to the shelves for more specific books, and had the Standard Book of Spells, Grades 2, 3, and 4 open in front of her as well. It was a few hours before she had 10 inches that she thought comprised an accurate comparison of swapping and switching spells, though she was not too certain of the paragraph in which she'd attempted to describe their relative level of difficulty. It was hard to know without having done the spells herself. After re-shelving all the charms books, she wandered to the history section and ran into a bit of trouble. The entire section was organized by author, not by period, so finding a reference beyond A History of Magic by Batilda Bagshot, which only contained a brief synopsis of the rebellion, proved impossible. Rigel had already skipped breakfast and only had a couple of hours left before she would be missed at lunch, so she decided to risk asking the librarian for help. It wasn't so unusual for a first year to be asking for books on 16th century goblin rebellions, surely. Madame Pince sat in silent judgment behind her ornate desk in the centre of the library. Her eyes roved the stacks at intervals for any sign of disruption, and there was something about her that reminded Rigel of a vulture. An air of underfed savagery lingered in the way her bony hands grasped the edges of the books she rescued from the return pile. As Rigel approached, she thought she saw the woman whisper reassuringly to one as she lovingly stamped its inner cover. "Excuse me," Rigel kept her voice sotto voce, knowing without being told that this was a woman who held the sanctity of the library's quiet in absolute reverence. Pince turned sharp, hungry eyes on her. "What do you want?" Her whisper was strangely articulated, developed, perhaps, over long years of speaking only at sub-volume. "I need information on a specific goblin rebellion," Rigel said softly. "But I don't know what book Pince cut her off impatiently. "Which rebellion?" "Urlag the Terrible's uprising in the Late 16th century, yes. North side of the fourth stack to the left in the history section. Her eyes longingly followed the path of her own directions. Sixth shelf from the bottom. There are 3 texts, all by Wilhelm Apofki, embossed with silver on the spines. Now go and be quiet. Rigel made her way back to the history section, marvelling at the mind capable of retaining and retrieving such exact information. She wondered if it was love or obsession that kept the knowledge clear in Pince's psyche. Rigel knew from experience the two often cohabitated. She counted the stacks and found the books Pince recommended. Wilhelm Apofki had written 3 books on the 16th century, one on the politics of that time, one on its economy and trade, and one on its art and culture. Urlag's rebellion was explored through a difference lens in each of them. Rigel had 8 inches written when she glanced at the big clock by the doors and realized lunch began in 5 minutes. She rolled her work reluctantly. Urlag turned out to be a fascinating goblin for his time period. He'd revolutionized the techniques of goblin warfare by inventing a system of wards that proved it was possible to lay siege to an entire community of witches and wizards. His rebellion had starved the wizarding government of the time into desperation by cutting off trade options until they agreed to renegotiate the goblins' contracts. Rigel stacked all 3 books on the 16th century and toted them over to the checkout desk so she could finish the essay in her room later. Madame Pince gave her a sour look as she pulled the books toward her to update their checkout logs. "Name?" "Rigel Black." Madame Pince went still, except for her hands, which convulsed on the books. "Black?" The books disappeared behind her desk. So fast, Rigel thought she must not be as old as she looked. "No books for you, you—" The librarian stood to glare down at Rigel, who was too stunned by the sudden vitriol to move. Pince's nostrils flared as she exhaled fiercely, like a dragon smoking out its prey. "Sirius Black nearly burned down my divination section." Pince slammed her hands down on the desk, leaning over it to deliver her scathing diatribe more directly. "Most of those books are handwritten accounts of long-dead seers, priceless tomes of knowledge." Rigel took a step backwards before her brain realized it was probably better not to make any sudden movements. Pince shook her head as she pointed a bone-thin finger toward the exit. No son of his is welcome here. Out, get out!" Pince's voice had risen to a shriek. Sanctity of the library be damned, and Rigel was drawing dirty looks from the other students, so she left the books and got out of there before someone could take house points. First Snape, now Pince. She had to wonder whether pretending to be Sirius's son was more of a hindrance than a help. Rigel didn't realize how fast she was walking until she passed a series of paintings she didn't recognize. She hadn't been paying attention to where she was going, taking any route available to put distance between her and the irate librarian. When she checked the map, it informed her she'd climbed 2 flights of stairs in her haste. She was in the eastmost corridor on the 5th floor. She wasn't going to figure out what to do about her library access on an empty stomach. Better to go to lunch and worry about the rest of it later. Rigel hiked up her book bag as she consulted the map for the quickest route. A set of crumbling stairs at the end of the corridor led directly to the 3rd floor. The stairs were only wide enough for 2 people across, and they were steeper than most, bypassing the 4th floor at a sharp angle, but they would put her nearer the main staircase at the bottom. Rigel was halfway down the stairs, thinking longingly of rice pudding, when a hot lance of magic pierced her calf from behind. A trip jinx. Archie had caught her more than once with it, though never on a flight of stairs. It bunched the muscles in her leg, forcing a spasm that pitched her forward into space, and the weight of her bag as it swung out ahead of her overbalanced her further. She had time to bring up her hands to protect her head and face, and then she was toppling into oblivion. When she woke, it was to a dull blanket of pain that shifted and sharpened in several places as she became aware enough to tease the sensations into actual sense. Her throbbing neck could be explained by the uncomfortable angle at which it sat. Half scrunched against the bottom step of the stairs, she vaguely recalled starting down. Bruises throbbed at her awareness, like blinking lights on a display. Her tongue felt swollen as though she had bitten it, and at first she thought she'd injured her back into an awkward position, but then she realized she was laying on top of her book bag. She hoped the essays weren't irreparably wrinkled. Rigel braced her right hand against the steps to push herself up to her knees, but when she shifted her body, pain pulled a whimper from her lips quicker than her brain could figure out what was wrong. Her left hand registered a panicked complaint, and somehow it had earned the power to make her stomach heave and her head spin. She forced herself to look. The strap on her bag had wrapped around her left wrist, tangled somehow between the trip and the fall, and forcibly tightened until her wrist snapped under the strain. Unwinding the strap would make it immeasurably worse, but she couldn't leave it that way. She forced her right hand to move, trying to imagine it was someone else's wrist, someone else's purple, swollen appendage that had to be unwound. She peeled and twisted the unbreakable strap away from the snapped joint, her stomach attempting mutiny several times, despite it having no breakfast or lunch with which to manufacture munitions. Pain swelled and throbbed as blood rushed back and forth across the depressurized divide, and she rocked against the feeling with a low keen as tears ran from her eyes, fleeing the carnage. She couldn't blame them. She wanted to flee from her own body as well, but she was trapped there in the hurricane of agony. When the roaring, churning tide of pain ebbed to something more constant, she risked another miserable look at the broken appendage. She could not fix it. She could find the hospital wing on the map, but she knew enough about medical magic from Archie to hesitate, even through the pain. A healer could tell all sorts of things about a patient. Diagnostic spells might reveal too much. How could she guarantee the Mediwitch looked only at her wrist and not the rest of her? A fall down a set of stairs would merit a scan for concussion, for internal bleeding, and Merlin only knew what else. Rigel levered herself onto the bottom stair without jostling her left arm, wondering if a spell to fix a broken wrist was something a first year could perform. She certainly wanted it badly enough to make the magic work, but she was also banned from the library. Perhaps an older Slytherin could teach her the spell if she found something to trade them for it. She was just checking the zipper on her bag to make sure nothing had fallen out of it when cheerful voices echoed down the third-floor corridor ahead. She arranged herself casually, draping her robes over her left hand and suppressing the sound she wanted to make as two boys came around the corner. It was Ron and Neville, probably on their way back from lunch. They stopped in surprise when they saw her sitting on the ground at the foot of the stairs. She tried to grit her teeth in a small smile. "Hi, Neville. Ron." Her voice sounded strained even to her own ears, and she knew she must look a mess, with her clothes and hair in disarray and tear tracks on her cheeks. The two Gryffindors gave her concerned looks. "Are you okay, Rigel?" Neville bit his lip, looking her over. "What are you doing on the ground?" Ron added. "Just so many stairs." She gestured vaguely to the steep flight behind her with her right hand. "Thought I'd take a break." The unintentional pun made a slightly hysterical voice in her head laugh into the abyss of pain. Neville nodded kindly. "It is a lot. Almost wish I'd been a Hufflepuff. They don't have to climb the whole castle 3 times a day." Ron set his face in a mulish look that said he wasn't going to be misdirected so easily. "I didn't see you at lunch, and you don't look tired. You look ill. Your face is gone all green. Have you been crying?" Rigel grimaced at Ron's sharp observational skills, and Neville misinterpreted the expression. "Were you really, Rigel? It's all right, you know. We wouldn't tell anyone, and there aren't any Slytherins around to see." She tried another smile, pretty sure it came out like a wince. "Thanks, Neville. I'll be okay, though. I'm a bit peckish from missing lunch. Shouldn't climb stairs on an empty stomach." "Well, that doesn't explain why you missed lunch, or why your clothes are roughed up and your face is getting greener by the moment. Godric, you look like you just fell off a cliff." His own words caught up to him as his eyes darted between her and the stairs behind her. She could practically see him counting her limbs, 3 visible, 1 not. His mouth settled into a grim line. "Or down a flight of stone steps. Show us your left wrist, Rigel." "Oh, no." Neville moaned as if it had been him who fell. "Did you trip?" "Yeah, I did," she admitted. She clutched the robes folded over her wrist. "I'm really okay, though, so you guys just go back to whatever." Ron strode forward and grabbed her forearm with incredible speed. He yanked her left hand out of her robes. An ugly cry ripped out of her throat, and Ron dropped her arm with a startled sound of his own. She cradled it protectively, blinking back another wave of tears, and Neville hissed sympathetically as Ron apologized over and over. She looked down at her wrist. It bent unnaturally away from her and was turning all sorts of alarming colors. She kept her mouth firmly shut and breathed through her nose. When he'd run out of curses and apologies, Ron seized command of the situation. "That's broken," he said firmly. "Neville, stay here while I go find a professor or someone who knows where the hospital wing is." "No," Rigel gasped, still riding the horse of pain. "No hospital wing." They looked at her like she was speaking gobbledygook. "I can't stand hospitals, and mediwizards too. They upset me." "You can't just leave it like that," Neville said. "It has to be set and healed, right?" "I won't go to the hospital wing." Ron began to pace as he tried to decide what to do. "Okay, if you won't, you won't. Then we'll take you back to our common room. Percy's there, and he's a prefect. He knows all kinds of magic. Maybe he can even set the bone or something." "Fine." Rigel was beginning to feel a little overwhelmed, and she wondered if that was the shock finally wearing off. Neville helped her stand, and Ron took her book bag. The three of them made their way slowly up the stairs, down the 6th-floor corridor, and up another flight until they stopped before a huge portrait of a voluptuous woman in pink. "Flitterglibs," Ron said clearly. The portrait swung outward to reveal an enormous hole. It was large enough to clamber through, but she had to question with incredulity the sheer annoyance it must be to do this daily several times. They piled in one after another, and Neville led her to a ring of furniture in front of the fire, while Ron ran off to find his brother. She had been sitting on one of the plushy red couches for only a minute or so when something that sounded like an avalanche came clambering down a nearby set of stairs. The crashing sound turned out to be Fred and George, both of whom were laughing uproariously as they pulled a protesting Ron along behind them. "No, Fred, George, stop it!" Ron twisted in their grasp. "I have to get to Percy. I don't have time for this." "Percy is incapacitated, baby brother," George said between laughs. "I promise you really don't want to see him right now." "Let go." Ron pulled backwards, but was no match for his brother's combined weights. "Gred, Forge, whoever you are, this is serious. I need Percy right—" Now, Ickle Ronikins," Fred shook his head admonishingly. "What could you possibly need Percy for when you've got us? Tell us your little first-year woes, and we promise not to mock you extensively." "Unless you really, really deserve it," George added. "Unless you can heal broken bones, you'd better go undo whatever you did to Percy so he can help me," Ron demanded. His face flamed like his hair in the heat of his anger. The twins sobered immediately. "Broken bones, you say?" Fred crossed his arms. "We've some experience with those, haven't we, Forge?" "Indeed we have, Gred. Depending on the type, of course. Whose bones did you break, Ron?" George's eyes moved critically over Ron's thin form. "'Cause all yours look just fine to me." "Not me," Ron said tiredly. "Another first year fell down some stairs and his wrist looks pretty bad." "Oh, wrist bones are tricky," George said. "Tell him to go to the hospital wing." "He won't go, says he hates hospitals," Ron explained. "Can't you do something to help, or do I need to get Percy after all?" "Oh, we can do something," Fred said cheerfully. "It'll hurt like hell, though." Ron blanched. Never mind then, I'll just—" He looked helplessly back toward the fireplace, where Neville and Rigel watched the exchange anxiously. The twins followed his glance and broke into grins. "Rigel!" Fred cried, bounding down the stairs and over to where she sat. "What are you doing here?" "We didn't expect you so soon." George's smile faded as he caught sight of her cradled wrist. "Ah, so the broken first year is you, is it? We might have known." "You do have a talent for falling downstairs, pup." Fred examined the purpling break, then shook his head grimly. "I'm afraid we're going to have to amputate this." Neville wobbled dangerously on his feet. "Just kidding," Fred said. "Actually, Fred and I break bones all the time." "You're Fred today, you forgetful git." George rolled his eyes affectionately. "But he's right, we do. We can set it for you if you really don't want to go to see Madame Pumphrey, but there are too many little bones in the wrist to risk fixing it magically myself. I can get them in about the right places, but they'll need to adjust by themselves a few millimeters here or there over the course of the healing." "Yep, it'll have to heal on its own, which will take about, 7 weeks, would you say?" Fred glanced at George with a raised eyebrow. "More like 5, with the ambient magic in this place helping out," George estimated. "The real trouble is we can't numb it until after it's set, because the only numbing spell we know also freezes the muscles to prevent usage." Rigel nodded tightly. "That's fine." It was more than fine. It was a solution that didn't involve risking the exposure of her secret, and that was worth nearly any amount of pain. "Just do it." The twins shrugged simultaneously. Ron looked on in horror as his brothers rolled up their sleeves ominously, and Neville turned his face away, looking greener than Rigel felt. "Try not to move sudden-like," Fred said, taking her left elbow in his hand. He lifted the arm so they could see the wrist clearly, and Rigel groaned as tension rushed back into her wrist. "I know, puppy." George spoke soothingly. He fingered his wand a bit nervously, and she hoped he really did know what he was doing. "Just a bit longer. You're going to feel a pop on 3. 1. He snapped out a word in Latin, and Rigel felt her bones grind against one another violently as the shadows at the edges of her vision rose up to annihilate her consciousness. The next, she knew, was a hand shaking her and a stiff bandage around a wrist she could no longer feel. "Rigel," George said, "back with us?" "It's okay now." Fred numbed and wrapped it, and it should stay numb until your body produces enough endorphins on its own. Eat a big dinner and make sure you don't roll onto it in your sleep tonight. All right? "It looks serious," Neville said, eyeing the wrapping that went from Rigel's thumb to her elbow. Fred rubbed his neck sheepishly. "I might have overdone the bandage a bit. Mum's way better at it. It's not so bad as injuries go. Rigel just won't be doing much left-handed for a while." "It's not my stirring or chopping hand anyway," Rigel mumbled, feeling slow and sleepy as her body pumped her with its own natural drugs. "How are you going to explain this?" Ron asked keenly. "Professors will want to know what happened, and also why you didn't go to Madame Pumphrey." "I want to know that too," George said mildly. "The last time you fell down a flight of stairs, we ran smack into you in the dark. You don't strike me as the clumsy sort, so who ran into you this time?" "No one ran into me," she said honestly. "I tripped." Fred caught her eyes. "Who tripped you then?" She didn't know how he guessed any more than she knew who tripped her. Ron and Neville shot her betrayed expressions as they realized she'd kept the specifics of her fall from them deliberately. "They got me from behind," she said, a bit defensive. "It could have been anyone, but I was on the 5th floor, east side." "Closest to Gryffindor," Ron said grimly, glancing around his common room. "Anyone can be anywhere in the castle," Rigel said, shrugging helplessly. "I was there, wasn't I? And it would be remarkably Slytherin to stage an attack as far from the dungeons as possible. Either way, someone wants our new protégé hurt," Fred said sadly. "I'm afraid when we find out who did this, we'll have to show them what's what, Gred." "Course we will," George said. The lightness of his tone contrasted starkly with the steadiness in his steady eyes. "Or my name isn't Forge." -0. The twins, Ron and Neville, sent her off with pockets full of sweets to substitute for the missed meals, and she thanked them profusely as she clambered back out of their portrait hole. The new bandage was awkwardly tight and came halfway down her hand, but as long as she let that arm hang by her side, her sleeve would cover it. If she was very careful, no one else ever needed to know of her injury. She entered the common room quietly, but her labor of stealth was not to bear fruit. The door was still sliding closed behind her when Pansy called out from one of the study tables, "Rigel, there you are!" Rigel looked over in time to see Draco's head swivel around toward her like a shark, scenting prey. She had a sudden impulse to check herself for blood. With all the casualness of a person who knows exactly what they did, she walked to their table. Keeping her left hand safely out of view, she hefted her book bag onto the table with her right hand and sat down next to Pansy, with Draco opposite them. Draco clearly wanted to know where she'd been all day, but she suspected pride would keep him from asking outright. Taking full advantage, she feigned ignorance, politely asking how their day was going instead of answering the myriad questions simmering in those silver eyes. Not as well as it could have done. Pansy cast a glance around the common room. Certain people have been asking where you were, and without any idea what to say, it's been a challenge to successfully divert their attention. She waited for Rigel to offer an explanation, and when Rigel resolutely maintained obliviousness, Pansy sighed prettily. Then, of course, there's this charms assignment that doesn't make any sense. I'm afraid I don't have a natural talent for charms. And yet you have so many, Rigel said, pulling her own charms assignment out of her bag. Pansy smiled. Glad to have you back, Rigel. Draco isn't nearly so good at flattery. Draco scowled at the pair of them. Let's just get this finished so we can have the rest of the weekend off. Rigel scanned the assignment. They were asked to gauge the limits of the levitation charm by discussing whether the suggested list of objects would or would not make good targets for the spell. Apples, rocks, tree limbs, and so on were listed as possible targets. Pansy was attempting to answer the question literally by practicing the charm on things of various weights to see whether it was strong enough to lift them. She muttered about the subjective nature of the assignment, as each person's magic was theoretically capable of different things, so Rigel just put no for everything except humans and called it done. Pansy finished soon after with a dissatisfied moo. Finally, she said, rolling up her assignment, I feel like going for a walk. Well, I haven't finished my potions essay yet. Draco scowled at the parchment and twirled his quill restlessly. So I guess you two can go without me. Actually, I haven't finished mine either, Rigel said. I thought you finished yours in class Friday. Pansy looked suspicious, as though Rigel might be trying to avoid walking with her. And if you weren't in the library working on the charms and potions assignments, then what were you doing all day with your book bag? Draco had found his opening at last. I was kicked out of the library before I could get any work done. Then I went for a walk, Rigel said. Pansy raised an eyebrow. Kicked out? What did you do? Absolutely nothing. Draco huffed exasperatedly. Don't tell us then. Let me see your potions essay at least. I'm not sure my conclusion makes sense. I don't have it, Rigel said. Then go get it. Draco waved her toward the dorms. I finished it already and gave it to Professor Snape. Rigel unrolled a clean sheet of parchment and carefully pinned it down with stones, all one-handed. Then she pulled out her dicto quill. But you just said you hadn't finished it. Even Pansy looked exasperated with her now. Snape gave me another one to complete for Monday. They both made noises of sympathetic understanding. Snape gave you extra work for turning it in early? Draco shook his head. That does sound like him, but he's usually nicer to Slytherins. I asked for the extra work. Do you mind if I dictate my essay? She asked Draco, since he would have to sit through it. Why don't you just write it? His heart didn't seem to be in the question, and she mentally congratulated herself for wearing him down. I'm incredibly lazy. Draco didn't smile at her joke, but he did shrug his permission for her to use the dicto quill. She knew it was an annoying way to complete an assignment when others were working in the same space, but the charms worksheet had been hard enough to complete one-handed. Trying to write an entire essay, even with stones to hold the parchment open, was sure to result in something incomprehensibly messy. Pansy left a charm blaze into escorting her on her desired walk, and the dicto quill sprang upright to attention as Rigel spoke firmly to it. Quill start! Essay on Nimue's breath, new line. Draco made a face and hunkered over his own essay. Rigel hid a smile and spoke a little louder than was necessary just to watch him grimace. Nimue's breath, commonly called the Widowmaker due to its use in Merseyside, is a small blue flower with sharp black thorns. It is commonly found in damp caves near salty bodies of water. The flower is the only part of the plant used in potions, and the flower is usually placed in the cauldron whole, unless the recipe specifically calls for the essence or perfume of Nimue's breath, such as in certain inhibition-lowering potions. She caught Draco's eye as he lifted his head to stare incredulously at her. She smiled, and the quill wobbled a little at the amusement in her voice as she continued. As such, special care must be taken when harvesting to ensure the petals don't separate or become crushed. It is best to use a small, serrated knife to cut the stem as close to the root as possible. The thorns are fewer at the base of the flower, although dragon hide or similar gloves are still recommended to prevent pricks. While the thorns are not poisonous like the flower is, any blood spilt over the flower causes it to lose its potency immediately. Draco put down his quill and frowned at her. Her smile widened. He hadn't heard anything yet. Nimue's breath is often mistaken for the Parsilia flower, which is the same size, shape, and color. The Parsilia flower isn't remotely poisonous, so it is important to differentiate between the two of them, but by no means should one check which flower they've come across by smell. There is a difference in smell. Parsilia smells a little like lavender, while Nimue's breath smells like honey and milk. But the smell of Nimue's breath is what makes it so dangerous. The perfume released by the flower contains a chemical that temporarily affects the brain's ability to make decisions and stimulates the part of the brain that reacts to pleasure. Inhaling it directly causes a wizard to feel so irrationally happy that he often refuses to leave the flower, taking in more and more of the perfume and neglecting to do anything else until he either dies of exposure or is rescued by someone unaffected. The ancient Greeks had a myth about an island full of these flowers, supposedly the creation of Orpheus. A field of Nimue's breath would not put a whole crew of men to sleep at a distance, however. As long as one does not breathe in directly over the stamen, the perfume alone is not strong enough to be a problem for the careful brewer. New line. Draco suddenly reached out to still the quill, capturing it in his hand so it didn't record his commentary as he said, "You talk about this flower like it's the most fascinating thing you've ever heard." "It is fascinating," Rigel agreed. "You don't show this much interest in any of our other subjects." "They aren't potions." Draco let go of the dicto quill and sat back in his chair, waiting for her to continue. Nimue's breath is the essential ingredient in many variations of Merlicide, the poison of choice for witches seeking to murder their partners. Draco snorted in amused surprise, and Rigel grinned over the quill. But it is also used in a number of other basic poisons. It is interesting to note that this flower is almost always used the same way. No matter the poison, the base is prepared first. The base is usually just common herbs and spices boiled into water for the sole purpose of disguising the poisonous ingredients. Next, the potioneer might add anything from nightshade to aconite, even common garden gnome poison, so long as it is deadly. These poisonous components, if correctly proportioned, disappear completely into the base. Then Nimue's breath is added. It only takes a single flower, whole and untouched, placed in the mixture at boiling temperature. The flower dissolves instantly and leaves behind its entrancing perfume. Nimue's breath itself is not deadly. However, Nimue's breath causes a poison to become irresistible to the drinker. It was especially common in the mid-14th century for witches to slip a potion laced with Nimue's breath into their husband's food or drink, then simply watch as he consumed the poison desperately, demanding more of his own death. "Bloody hell," Draco muttered, too low for the quill to catch. New line. It is vital that Nimue's breath be added to a potion at boiling point. Otherwise, instead of dissolving, the flower will only congeal and stick to the side of the cauldron. Therefore, the flower must be added while brewing a poison for the first time. One cannot purchase or pre-make a poison, then add Nimue's breath to it unless it is a poison that can handle being reheated without destabilizing. New line. Sometimes the essence or nectar of the flower is added in tiny doses to anti-inhibitors, such as certain alcoholic beverages, recreational drugs, or aphrodisiacs, but care should be taken in adding the irresistible qualities of Nimue's breath to an already addictive substance. One can recognize the presence of Nimue's breath in a liquid by looking for a characteristic mother-of-pearl sheen out of the corner of one's eye. Nimue's breath sells for approximately 11 sickles per flower, though it becomes more expensive during the wet season due to the increased difficulty in procuring it as its natural caves fill with water. That looked about 10 inches, so Rigel wrapped it up quickly. New line. In conclusion, Nimue's breath is an essential element in many poisons, despite it being intrinsically non-toxic. It has very few legal uses, and the conscientious brewer should be wary of working with it. If using the flower is unavoidable, wearing gloves when harvesting and avoiding direct inhalation should be sufficient protection. Stop quill. Rigel cast drying sand on the parchment. "How's yours going?" she asked, deliberately baiting. Draco's quill nib had long since dried of ink. The blonde stared at her like she was a big cat exhibit at the zoo. She supposed he was waiting for her to yawn widely and show off her teeth. "Why?" He cleared his throat. "Why are you even looking for extra tutelage in potions? I mean, it sounds like you already know everything. What's Snape even going to teach you?" Rigel couldn't help but smile. Her potions knowledge was well earned, but it was endearing that he thought Snape didn't have much more to teach her. Understanding ingredients to a potions master is like knowing the alphabet to a poet. I've learned what I can on my own, and I'd like to think I'm ahead of most first years, but there's so much I can't learn without brewing and dedicated instruction. There's more than just memorizing recipes. There's brewing techniques, strategies, instincts, timing, and most of all, practice. So many things I only know in theory. Okay. Draco held his hands up in surrender. "I get it. You're not at Snape's level yet?" Rigel snorted. "As if I'll ever be. Is my godfather really that good?" Draco seemed skeptical, and it made her mouth fall open to realize he'd no idea what kind of genius he had access to his entire life. At her flabbergasted expression, he crossed his arms defensively. "What?" "He spends his time teaching school kids." "He's the best in all Britain," Rigel said. On that she held absolute conviction. "His work is on the cutting edge of potions research. He's created dozens of original recipes, finding new ways to use ingredients no one else has thought of, not to mention the significant improvements he's made to a number of notoriously tricky advanced potions. But it's more than that." Rigel wasn't sure how to explain. No one at home ever wanted to hear her opinions on Snape, so she'd never articulated them aloud before, but she tried. "It's his understanding of the art of it. All the articles in publication are professionally interesting, but Snape's articles are the ones you read again. The way he writes about potions is like the way other people write about philosophy, warfare, even love. Reading it, you can only think that to Professor Snape, potions is breathing, it's being. That's how good he is. That's the whole reason I'm here. Someday." She had never put the dream of her heart into these words before, but she thought Draco wouldn't laugh. "I want potions to be like breathing to me, too." "Well," Draco looked away, obviously taken aback by her uncharacteristic fervour. "I'm sure if anyone can reach that level, it's you. Just from one essay, it's obvious you're waist-deep in this stuff. In fact," he flashed her a smug smile, "I'm going to be proud to say we're friends one day." Rigel made a face, aware that he had intended to both compliment and embarrass her simultaneously. "If we're still friends when I get my mastery, I'll give you a special discount on anything I brew." "Including poisons?" "I won't be that kind of potioneer." She sobered. "I want to be a researcher like Professor Snape. Create new potions, improve old ones, that sort of thing." "I never knew all that stuff about my godfather," Draco said, thoughtful. "He doesn't like to boast about his work. I think that's why he and my father get along so well. Father hates people who boast." "I'll keep that in mind." Rolling up her essay, she cast a glance at his. "Still need help with your conclusion?" Draco pushed it toward her with a smirk. "If you look over it, I'm sure to get a good mark." Rigel reached for it, remembering just in time not to use her left hand. It was going to take some practice to make using one hand for everything look natural. She was hoping to avoid anyone noticing as long as possible, but if it came down to it, she would simply imply that she'd already been to the hospital wing, hence the wrapping. She didn't think anyone would, though. Most people didn't look for duplicity until they already knew something was wrong. When Draco was satisfied with his essay, he jumped up from the table and shot Rigel a boyish grin. "Let's go flying!" Rigel prevaricated. "I'm pretty tired." She was, in fact. Also, there was no way she should fly with a broken wrist. Draco leveled a stern look at her. "Rigel, I've barely seen you in days." "That is a brazen exaggeration." "Tryouts are next weekend for Slytherin, so we need to practice." "I'm not trying out for the team." "First years don't usually get spots, but it's good to show interest so they can scout you next year," Draco explained, deliberately misunderstanding her. "Anyway, we have to take advantage of the opportunities on offer. Did you know first years didn't used to be able to even have brooms at Hogwarts? We're living in a golden age." Rigel had never met Draco's father, but sometimes she could hear him speaking out of Draco's mouth. First years used to be banned from having brooms at Hogwarts because there was a valid concern that Muggle-borns, unfamiliar with the mechanics of broom riding, would injure themselves if left to fly unattended. Their flying lessons were in fact a holdover from that time as well. That had all changed when Riddle's SOW party had forced his anti-Muggle-born legislation packages through the Wizengamot. She supposed she could not expect an 11-year-old who didn't know any Muggle-borns to be concerned with anything other than how the change benefited him, but she was not as enthused about taking advantage of this golden age as he might presume. "Can you at least come and help me practice?" Draco's expression was so earnestly imploring she could feel the physical facade of her resistance crumbling in its wake. She tried to mentally overlay his face with something less endearing, but his wide silver eyes brought to mind only puppies, sad puppies, left out in the rain. 20 minutes later, Rigel found herself on the Quidditch pitch, holding an old-school broom in her right hand, a beater's bat under her armpit, and wondering how exactly she'd been talked into such a terrible idea. She could fly one-handed. That wasn't the problem. All positions in Quidditch involved some one-handed flying, and as a beater she could spend an entire game with one hand gripping a bat. But there was a difference between flying with one hand free and flying with no hand to grip the broom. Not to mention the difficulty of protecting an injured hand against jostling. She didn't think the twins meant her to test the numbing spell so aggressively. Still, the tryout was important to Draco, so for the sake of their stilted and still burgeoning friendship, she would try. Draco tied a bag of wingless golden orbs to her broom. They would stand in for snitches, and she would use her bat to propel the small balls in various directions for him to catch. Draco was riding the latest comet. He leapt into the sky so fast he might have been a firework, just waiting to be set off. She squeezed the school broom with her knees and followed slowly, cradling her left hand in her lap, so it looked like she was holding on with it. Hopefully he wouldn't think to correct her grip. Rigel took a few minutes to get used to the rhythm of tossing a ball into the air, grabbing her bat from under her armpit and hitting it before it came down. Beater was Rigel's favourite position to play, and the one she probably would have tried out for if circumstances were different. Sirius would be expecting Archie to try, but even if she'd wanted to brave the locker room and risk an injury that might put her in the hospital wing, she wouldn't be able to try out with a broken wrist. Perhaps she could simply lie and tell him she hadn't made the team. Draco wasn't too bad, as far as she could tell. Rigel wasn't swinging the bat with her usual speed, but she gave Draco a good workout by sending the little balls first one way, then the other, for about an hour. They hadn't requested the lights be turned on, as this wasn't an official practice, so it was too dark to see the balls once the sun went down. They gave up the bat and balls and practiced flying maneuvers, Draco showing her all his tricks and Rigel concentrating on staying steady in the air. 10 minutes before dinner, they headed inside. Draco was grinning confidently, hair fluffed wildly about his head and cheeks flushed from the exercise. He looked like he'd stepped out of a 1940s ad for Muggle aeronauts. She could easily picture him with one of those long scarves and a set of pilot goggles perched jauntily atop his head. Rigel knew her face, on the other hand, was pale, and she was sweating. It wasn't a sweat from exertion, but a cold sweat, from the small waves of nausea that had lapped at her for the last half hour or so. "You're really not that bad on a broom," Draco said generously as they sat between Knot and Pansy at the dinner table. "It's hard to balance with only one hand while swinging a bat if you're not used to it." "It was quite a challenge," Rigel agreed, serving herself a large helping of pasta. The sweets from earlier sat uneasily in her stomach, and she hoped the weight of the carbohydrates would settle the lingering nausea into quiescence. "Are you guys trying out for the team then?" Knot asked over his kidney pie. "Obviously," Draco declared. "No," Rigel said simultaneously. "I'm for Seeker," Draco elaborated. With a supportive look at Rigel, he added, "You could, you know. You could be a keeper. They don't have to move around as much." "Maybe next year," Rigel offered. Even as she said it, she knew she shouldn't give the boy hope. Better to be firm from the outset, otherwise she'd have to refuse him all over again next year. The events of the day caught up to her around dessert, and Rigel excused herself early and made her way back to the dorms. In the morning, she would have to figure out how to get library access so she could finish those essays for Flint. She didn't want them hanging over her all week. If there was no other option, she could always use her dad's invisibility cloak. Then she would be stealing books instead of checking them out, though, and Pince had seemed like the kind of librarian who would notice. She was so tired, mentally and physically, from her first day without classes, that she fell asleep without bothering to take off her shoes. She cradled her broken wrist protectively against her side, and her last ominous thought, before dropping like a stone into the river, sleep, was that she still had no idea who wanted her hurt badly enough to hex her down a flight of stone steps in broad daylight. Only time would tell if it had been a random prank or a premeditated attack. We hope you enjoyed this chapter. Please consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon linked in the description, or become a member here on YouTube, where you will get access to several additional chapters weeks before they release on YouTube.